All right, welcome to day 9 of this visualization program. And today we are going to be looking simply at diagonals. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to get rid of all the stuff on this chessboard right now. And we will create a similar type position. So, the first thing we want to look at is let's just notice that the two long diagonals on the chessboard, the one from A1 to H8 and the one from H1 to A8, both end up on the corners of the board. So that's a pretty obvious thing, but let's just point that out. Now let's just pick the light squared long diagonal, draw that on the board, and let's start looking at the diagonals that run parallel to this long light squared diagonal. So one diagonal runs from G1 to H7. That is one diagonal away from this long diagonal. And there's some interesting properties if we look at these diagonals. They're obvious, but they're actually useful. Is that when we go one diagonal away from the long diagonal, the diagonal will hit the edge of the board that many squares away from the corner. So we're one diagonal away from the long diagonal, and we hit the edge of the board one square away from the edge of the board. So if we go two diagonals away from the long diagonal, this F1 to A6 diagonal, we are two diagonals away from this long diagonal, which means we are two squares away from the corner. And another thing to just note is that when you are odd number of diagonals away from the long diagonal, you are on the opposite color of that long diagonal. So the long diagonal is white. When you go one diagonal away, you are on a dark colored diagonal. And when you are even numbers of diagonals away from the long diagonal, so this F1 to A6 diagonal is two diagonals away, an even number of diagonals away from the long diagonal, you are on the same colored diagonal. And so these rules hold no matter which direction we go from the long diagonals. So we'll just draw a couple more real quickly. Note that we are 1, 2, 3 diagonals away from the long diagonal. So we are going to be on the opposite color of the long diagonal, and it's a dark square diagonal. And since we are 3 diagonals away, we are 3 squares from the edge of the board. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so that's the first thing to just kind of notice. And what we'll do is we'll just kind of use the other diagonal and real quickly just draw in a couple of these parallel diagonals and see that these rules hold. So let's look at the long dark square diagonal, A1 to H8. And let's just draw some diagonals in. So if we compare we won't do each one, but if we look at these diagonals, these parallel diagonals in comparison to the long diagonal, let's look at this E1 to H4 diagonal. We are 1, 2, 3, 4 diagonals away from the long diagonal, so it's an even number, so it should be the same colored diagonal. And we should end that many squares away from the corner. So if we go here, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and means we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 squares away from the corners of the long diagonal. And you can kind of just, pause the video, look at this, kind of, look at the relation of these other diagonals. But that's the key point I wanted to point out, is that there is, this relationship, which is a good thing to kind of note. And so now what we'll do is we'll move on to the exercise for this week. You may want to watch this video, this front part of this video again. But we'll try to just get a way to practice looking at this. And to do that, we're going to use the chess.com vision trainer. So I'm going to load that up here, and I'll just show you what we're going to do as an exercise for this week. All right, so the task for this week, or for today I should say, is using the vision trainer on chess.com or the coordinate trainer on Lichess, is to just a half a dozen times. What we're going to do is we're going to go through, have it tell us a square, and we're going to look at the long diagonal and short diagonal of that square in relation to the long central diagonals. So I'll do one or two here, and then your task for the day is to do this 6 times. All right, so let's boot up the trainer here, and I'll just maybe do two runs and go through what we want to accomplish here. So I'll hit the start button, and it will give us a coordinate, and the coordinate it gave us was G1. And so what we want to do is not click on that coordinate, but what we want to do is look at that coordinate in relation to both long diagonals. So let's look at the long light square diagonal first, the one that runs from H1 up through A8, and we won't worry about the timer. It'll go off on us. That's fine. And then let us see how many diagonals it is away from that long diagonal. And it is one diagonal away, G1 through A7. And so both ends of that diagonal where it hits the edge of the board should be one square away from the corner, which it is, one square away from the corner of that diagonal. So G1 is one square away from H1, and A7 is one square away, A7 is one square away from A8. Now, the other thing to notice is just that because it is one square away from that diagonal is the opposite color of that long diagonal. So the long diagonal we're looking at first is the light diagonal. This diagonal, G1 through A7, therefore is a dark diagonal. Now let's look at the same square G1 in relation to the long dark diagonal. So G1 in relation to the diagonal A1 through H8. So let's see how many diagonals it is away from that diagonal. So it is, here's one diagonal, two diagonals, three diagonals, four diagonals, five diagonals, six diagonals away. And so because that's an even number, it is the same color. And the other thing we can take from that is that the diagonal, the dark square diagonal, G1 to H2, should be 6 squares away where it hits the diagonal, 6 squares away from the edge of the board of the long diagonal. So G1, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the other end of its diagonal is H2, and that should be 6 squares away from H8, the corner of the long square diagonal. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And my recommendation would just be to do that exercise 5 times. Just go slow. Just visualize, just count the diagonals off in your head. So let's just do another one real quick. We'll just do one diagonal for this one. But E5 is actually on the long diagonal. So if you get one that's on the long diagonal, just go ahead and click it and get your next one. So this one we got A7. And so let's do it in relation to the long light square diagonal of H1 through A8. So it is one diagonal away from that. And so the ends of this diagonal should only be one square away from where that hits the edge of the board. And it is, because A7 is one square away from A8 and G1 is one square away from H1. And the other thing to note is that because it's only one diagonal away from that long light square diagonal, it'll be on the opposite color of that diagonal. So it is a dark square diagonal. So then we would do the same thing and do that in relation to the A1 to H8 diagonal. So you do it for both long diagonals, that square and its diagonal, its long and short diagonals in relation to um, both the light and dark long square diagonal. So just do that 5 or 6 times, and that's it for today. So good luck on that one, and we will see you tomorrow. Thanks.